Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video, we're going to talk about the basics. The basics of marksmanship, the fundamentals of marksmanship, are not necessarily the same thing depending on the context of the conversation or the, foundation of training, firearms training, shooting training of the person who's actually having the conversation. So if you talk to somebody about the fundamentals of marksmanship who their primary formal instruction came from, say, the 60s, 70s, 80s, their definition might be different to a certain degree, or maybe a wide degree, depending on the specificity of the topic, to somebody who's trained in the 90s, early 2000s, so on and so forth. A lot of people look to the armed forces, the military, for the fundamentals, the bedrock of marksmanship training, especially on the rifle. And you see conversations come up, or maybe you've been involved in a conversation where somebody brings up, well, you need to get back to the basics to improve your skill. No, you don't. Words mean things, so definitions are going to be slightly different, again, based on the time period in which the person learned the knowledge that they're calling on, that knowledge that became indelible in them, that knowledge that they'll never, quote-unquote, forget, even though stuff's supposed to be perishable if you don't work on it. So there's kind of a dichotomy there. But what we're talking about is the fundamentals of marksmanship. And the fundamentals of marksmanship vary slightly depending on what kind of platform or firearm we're talking about. Handgun versus rifle, there's some slight differences. Some fundamentals don't matter as much, even though they still do matter. Now, I'm going to talk about the fundamentals as I understand them. And again, my formal training began in the late 90s in the Army, and then continued on from there. So my fundamental definitions may be different from somebody whose fundamental training began in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, so on and so forth. And while some people may be like, well, do the 50s matter? They do, because someone who was trained in the fundamentals in the 50s and then passed that along, that knowledge still exists. And while that knowledge might not necessarily be wrong depending on the topic, it is different now. If you went through the Army in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then you got out in 2005, 2006, whatever your year is, the rifle training has changed dramatically from what you learned. Sports, not really a thing anymore. Shouldn't have been a thing to begin with. It was lowest common denominator instruction, but that's an example. And if you don't believe me, Google it. What I'm talking about, the fundamentals as I know them. Let's use the rifle, for example. We've got grip, pretty important. We've got stance, pretty important. We've got trigger control. We've got sight picture, sight alignment, follow through. What else is there? Depending on your definition of the fundamentals, there might be other aspects that you'd consider to be fundamental. But fundamental and basics aren't necessarily the same thing. And I bring this up because there's been, as of late, some recent conversations that have taken place in social media and questions I've been asked. If you want to get back to basics, you got to shoot iron sights on the rifle. No. Iron sights are not basics. They are a skill. They are the fundamentals applied to a sighting system. If I'm using a red dot, I don't get to ignore the fundamentals of shooting. It doesn't allow me to ignore my trigger squeeze. It does not allow me to ignore control of breathing. It does not allow me to ignore proper grip. That's just foolishness. Iron sights are slightly more difficult to master than a red dot. The reason being is we're using 3 focal plane shooting, and on a rifle we may be shooting at a greater distance. So I've got a rear focal plane, I've got a front focal plane, there's 2 focal planes, rear sight, front sight. Then I've got my target, and there's some reconciliation, some reaccommodation of the human eye that has to take place in relationship between those 3 focal planes in order to shoot accurately if I'm doing my other fundamentals correctly. Whereas with the red dot, I have single focal plane shooting. I focus on the target, I superimpose the dot over where I want to hit, I break the shot. The only caveat to that is, and this is a technique-driven conversation, some people prefer to focus on the dot at extreme distances or in certain lighting conditions because they feel like that's going to give them a better advantage in be able to get hits. My argument, of course, is you can do the same by staying target focused like the sight is designed, but you can still get the work done being dot focused. And some people shoot dot focused the entire time for whatever reason. That's not any more difficult than the iron sights. But the iron sights have their own unique nature about them. So someone feels like, well, if they can hit 200 yards with iron sights, then they must be doing the fundamentals right. And I would argue, yeah, you are. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have some sort of smug mastery of the skill set over someone who can do the same thing with a red dot. If someone finds themselves struggling in their skill set, they're trying to get better, people say, well, go back to the basics. But that's not what they're working on. If you've mastered driving at 30 miles an hour and you're struggling with the concept of cornering at 50, 60 miles an hour on like a, close to a 90-degree turn, as an analogy, why would somebody then tell you, well, you need to go back to parallel parking? Well, you need to go back to remembering to turn your wheels in or turn your wheels out, depending on what kind of curb you're on, a hill. Well, you need to go back to 30 miles an hour because you just can't master 60. That's a completely erroneous conversation, but that's something that people bring up, and that's kind of the analogy that I'm getting to, is if someone is struggling at a higher functional level, the advice of go back to the beginning is not necessarily, and in many cases, not useful at all. What you're telling them to do is, well, forget about working on what you're actually trying to work on. What you need to go is go back and work on what you're already become proficient at, because somehow that's going to become perishable. If I'm utilizing the fundamentals of marksmanship, regardless of what I'm trying to accomplish, be it iron sights or red dots, and I've gotten to a certain point where I'm trying to achieve a greater degree of proficiency, the evidence of me already being proficient at the basics is, well, self-evident. So if someone's trying to work on, let's use an example. They're working on getting faster splits, A-zone at 50 meters with the rifle on iron sights or red dot, and they just can't quite get their time down to where they want it. Say they're trying to get 2 rounds in a second, which is a pretty good achievement at 50 meters, depending on the shooting position, standing, prone, whatever. If they can't quite get it and someone comes up to them and says, well, what you really need to do is go back to the basics and shoot steel at 300 meters. What? That doesn't even make sense. Is that good practice? Yes, but is it purposeful, deliberate practice for the skill that's attempting to be accomplished? Absolutely not. And I get it. A lot of guys love iron sights. They use the great throwaway line, well, it works for me. And I'm sure it does, but you have to realize that shooters are at different levels. Right now, someone watching this video may be having a problem working on a sub-second reload with a handgun. There's another shooter who may be watching this video who's still trying to figure out to remember to put the magazine in the gun correctly every single time. They're both having a problem, but one problem is a higher functioning problem than another. And some people like to assume that all shooters are on the same skill level, and that's just absolutely not the truth. That's not the case. There are people out there who have more experience than you. There are people out there who shoot better than you, whether you're willing to admit it or not. And there are people out there who can think through problems faster than you. And that's all of us. So the throwaway advice of, well, you just need to go back to the basics is completely, well, it's ridiculous and it's a little irresponsible. So here's one of my rifles. You've probably seen this pop up in some videos lately. It's an ADM UIC. As you can see, it still has iron sights on it. I have not forgotten how to use these. I still practice with them occasionally to remain proficient because iron sight use is somewhat of a perishable skill, arguable how perishable. But I also have a red dot on it. If my red dot happens to fail, I have iron sights that I can flip up and use in this emergency fantasy situation, or the super fantasy of the EMP has taken place. I didn't forget how to use iron sights. I came up on iron sights. My first formal instruction was on an M16A2. I only had iron sights. I didn't get my M68 CCO until I actually got to my first unit, and I was like, red dot, what's this? And then the iron sights were kind of like, you'll shoot on them for qual, but we don't use them other than that. And that's kind of the point. This is a sighting system that exists. You'll notice that if you dig into the history of firearms, there's other sighting systems that have gone the way of the buffalo, if you will. Some people may stay proficient on them, but it's not something that's necessarily used anymore. So I keep these iron sights on my gun because I have room for them. If I didn't have room for them, if I had to introduce another sighting system, say as a night vision laser, and there just wasn't enough rail space, which this gun there would be, but using it as an example, the iron sights would be the first thing that got voted off the gun. Because how many points of aim do I really need, and how far am I going to go into Fantasyland before I realize I'm in Fantasyland? I've got a red dot and I've got a laser that's both IR and visible. Those are 3 potential ways to shoot. If I've got room for iron sights, I'll keep them on there. If I don't, they get voted off the island first because I'm less likely to use them. I think some of it is round count jealousy. I think some people look at shooters who are able to shoot all the time and they say, well, it must be nice. It is. That doesn't make them necessarily a better shooter than you, but it certainly provides them with a greater opportunity to become a better shooter than you. Because you can shoot 2,000 rounds wrong. You can shoot 2,000 rounds right. You have people who've never taken a functional or formal training class in their life, and I would be willing to argue and probably put a significant amount of money on the fact that if you take 2 shooters, one who doesn't train and one who does, and they have them shoot the same amount of ammunition, the guy who's taken classes from reputable instructors is going to be a more proficient shooter and a more proficient problem solver in unknown circumstances. These things matter. If someone puts more time and dedication into a skill, they're going to be better at it. This is kind of analogous to sitting on the couch with chip crumbs all over yourself and complaining about an Olympian who didn't stick the landing. Yeah, you can do it and it's kind of funny, but there's a lack of critical thinking there. That person has put in hours and hours and hours and thousands of hours of work, whereas you're just judging them from a pedestrian standpoint. It's the internet and it's the firearms community. I'll use the term community for this. So, of course, we're all due our male machismo posturing and just posturing in general over something that we love to argue about. Basics and the fundamentals are and aren't the same thing. The argument just keeps coming up. If you have gear, if you've got Gucci gear, then you must have suffered at the fundamentals, and gear is your shortcut. There is no free lunch. There are no shortcuts. If you suck with iron sights, you're going to suck with a red dot, because the fundamentals do not change. Basics of shooting include any sighting system you're going to use, because at the end of the day, sight picture and sight alignment only change in relation to how they're performed given the sighting system. Sight picture and sight alignment on iron sights is somewhat more complicated than sight picture sight alignment on a red dot or a reticle magnified optic. But sight picture sight alignment still exists. The same mistakes you can make in iron sights, you can also make in red dots if you fail to respect and adhere to the fundamentals of shooting. So just me, if I had a wish, I'd wish that people would realize that words mean things. And the advice of, well, if you're struggling with this higher functioning skill, you should go back to the beginning. That's just not, we don't do that with anything else. But for some reason in shooting, anytime you hit a wall or anytime you don't see improved performance, you're supposed to go to like ball and dummy drills, or you're supposed to do the dime on the top of the front sight post drill. And those are useful insofar as they're useful. But they're not necessarily going to be functionally helpful if I'm trying to work on a more complicated skill set. So it's not good advice. It's layman's advice, and it's something that I would wish people would think more critically about. Fundamentals and basics. You should stay proficient with iron sights if you're going to keep them on your rifle. And of course the argument is, well, you should have them on there even if you're using a red dot, because red dots can fail. Absolutely they can, but we're not talking about the red dots from the late 70s, early 80s anymore. We're talking about modern red dots. I shot in ammunition last year alone what some people make in a year. And that's not me bragging, that's just me saying this is how much I shot. We're talking thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds. And I didn't have a red dot fail on me. Didn't have iron sights fail either. Obviously I didn't shoot them as much. They're folded down, they're out of the way. The red dot can and cannot fail, depending on the circumstances you put it in. Most modern, trusted brand name red dots are going to last just as long as the iron sights on your gun. So yeah, you should stay proficient with them. You should know how to use them, but that doesn't mean that you should take the red dot off your gun and spend the next 4 or 5 months only shooting iron sights to respect the process, because the process is the fundamentals, not the sighting system you use. So the fundamentals should be applied to any sighting system you use, not a specific one. I don't consider iron sights to be basic. They are a sighting system to which the fundamentals are applied, and it really is that easy. So we got to kind of think of things in a different way, and of course you may not agree with me, and that's fine. You may have a really reasonable counter debate, and I'd love for you to drop it in the comment section below, if you can, actually factually or just on an educated opinion refute what I said. But the basics are the basic steps that are taken for a specific skill, not the wide-reaching fundamentals that we have in firearms. So just something to think about, and just kind of my take on basics versus fundamentals and the relationship between each other, and the whole ubiquitous iron sight debate that we just never seem to stop having. I can't wait until, I probably won't be around for this, but in the future when we aim guns with our mind and people tell you, oh, you need to go back to basics and shoot a red dot. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.